Good morning. I'm very glad to be here at Washington, D.C. at this university, and thank you to Startup Society's Foundation for making this summit happen and convening so many great minds here today. I'd like to introduce the amazing people that are joining us on this panel, starting to my right with Annie Mayol. She's the CEO and COO of Foundation for Puerto Rico, and she'll be sharing some amazing stuff that they've been working on. I'd like to introduce Luis Davila. He's an attorney at DLA Piper, and Jesse Levine. Thank you so much for being here and joining us in this panel. I'd like to make this panel very interactive, so please feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions, and if it's okay with you to be interrupted, I think it would be worthwhile to make it interactive and answer your questions as we go along, and we'll also leave some time at the end for additional questions. As a bit of an introduction, I'd like to share with you some things that, I'll change here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. There's not a clicker, so I'm going to be here showing you sharing with you some amazing things that we were able to experience after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah,
closer. Okay, thank you. So, it might be very utopian, right, to think of Puerto Rico as an innovation and an entrepreneurship hub right after the worst disaster on record hit us a few months ago. But what we've learned is that a disaster such as this does not easily impact our entrepreneurs and our innovators, because this is what actually fuels them to create opportunities or to identify opportunities. And perhaps if I were here a month after the hurricane, I would not have sounded so optimistic. It was a really tough time to be in Puerto Rico during those months following the hurricane. But time is the best thing that happens, and I am much more optimistic about the future of our island. After seeing so many things that are happening, I think that it's very valuable for us to share with you what we are doing, because not only it increases your sense of optimism, but it actually creates opportunities for us to grow. In Puerto Rico, there is an increasingly more robust entrepreneurial ecosystem, and it makes it a little bit more cumbersome for entrepreneurs to navigate that ecosystem and to identify the resources they need to grow their business. And that is why we exist at Colmena66. We are a program of the Puerto Rico Science, Technology, and Research Trust. That is a nonprofit. And we are also an affiliate of SourceLink. SourceLink was funded by Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City 15 years ago. It has since spread to another 28 communities in the United States, and it started in Puerto Rico just a year and a half ago. So with that, I just want to highlight that we are part of a network that has been sharing best practices and lessons learned about how to best help our entrepreneurs start or grow their business. So how do we do that, right? We link entrepreneurs with the resources, and we also work with organizations that provide entrepreneurial support, also known as our resource partners in our resource network, to continuously identify gaps in our ecosystem and how can we work together to better support our entrepreneurs. In our beehive, Colmena is beehive in Spanish, and it's the analogy of that. In our beehive, entrepreneurs can find everything they need for their business. And Puerto Rico has always been on the edges. We've always had this complex relationship with the United States, and I think that one of the things that we have to thank Maria for is that a lot more people learned that we are U.S. citizens. So that's kind of an example of how we are always, we've been on the edges. And you might have learned about Puerto Rico quite before the hurricanes. We made quite the splash with our $72 billion debt. This, you've heard a lot about what started this and what impact this has had in our economy. In terms of our entrepreneurs, how has this impacted our entrepreneurs? Well, in many ways, it has really impacted the access to capital for entrepreneurs in all phases of their development, particularly in seed capital, proof of concept capital, and growth capital. And in the same way, it has impacted non-for-profit organizations that perhaps many funders have been more on the sidelines, right, of supporting Puerto Rico. Many of them, however, started looking at us again after the Hurricane Maria. So again, opportunities have risen out of difficulties. September 20th, 2017, a day we will never forget. And it happened. We knew it was coming our way. It was massive. It was 11 p.m. and lights went off, and they didn't come on for many months. Many people in Puerto Rico, much more than the 3% that you hear, do not have electricity yet. And I was one of the lucky ones. I didn't have telecommunications for only 3 days. No access to your cell phone. Imagine that. I didn't know how my mom was doing until it was safe to get in a car and drive 2 days after that. And I was lucky. Many friends of mine had to wait 2 weeks to be able to know how their grandparents and parents were doing. So with this, I just want to highlight that we were far from thinking about how do we help our entrepreneurs. We were really just thinking about how do we stay alive, how do we keep people, how do we give people their basic necessities back. And again, our job is to help entrepreneurs, so you can imagine how anxious and frustrated we were that we just didn't have the time or the mental capacity to think about how to do that. We were startled. We were overwhelmed. So many things to do. How do we start? We were just asking ourselves, what is normality? Will we ever go back to normal? And yeah, we got some response, interesting response. And it just made us feel like, so what's gonna happen now, right? We thought, how do we shake this off? How do we actually start working together again? And I literally remember many of our organizations that provide entrepreneurial support. We got together a couple of weeks after that, and we were like, who's gonna think about starting a business now? Who's gonna think about growing a business? We're just about helping them not have to close for too many months so that they don't have to go out of business. And it was a really, really tough time. So here's what we did. With this, I want to share with you how we were able to just shake it off and determine what we could do with what we had. First things first, the Science, Technology, and Research Trust finally had access to Wi-Fi on October 10th. This was again September 20th, October 10th. So imagine going all that time without being able to answer your emails and work. So we quickly, in a matter of 24 hours, we made the Science Trust open as a temporary co-working space, totally free, so that all these entrepreneurs could continue their operations. And we had an overwhelming response. And we made it temporary because we didn't want to duplicate the efforts of existing co-working spaces. They were just out of capacity at that moment. We were like literally overwhelmed with how many people needed our services, so we needed more supply. But then we saw when things were starting to get to normal, we wanted to make sure that co-working spaces continued, to have the traffic that they need. And this, when we were able to be a neutral convener, and this is important in every community, to have a neutral convener that builds trust with the ecosystem players. And we were able to determine how, as an ecosystem, we were going to help our entrepreneurs and not duplicate, but strengthen our individual efforts. So we decided that the first thing, as a collective, we decided that the first thing we needed to do was learn and listen to our entrepreneurs and understand what they were going through, their needs and their losses. So we conducted an island-wide census. Again, this would have been online had it been under normal circumstances, but it wasn't. So we had a hotline, again, but many people didn't even have telephone access. So we went across the island. A group, many of these organizations that provide entrepreneurship supports, SBA, the public sector, statewide government organizations and agencies, a lot of nonprofits, academia. We went together on this roadshow across Puerto Rico, and even in, basketball courts, we were talking to these entrepreneurs and collecting this data. And this is where technology comes in. At the Puerto Rico Science, Technology, and Research Trust, our CEO, Lucy Crespo, she's a super visionary leader, and she's always about how do we scale things by using technology. And we were able to use this GIS tool that allowed us to have tablets on the ground collecting this data, and then as soon as we went back to our headquarters, we would be feeding this dashboard real time with all the data. We were able to collect data from over 1,000 businesses in the space of 2.5 months. And if you go to the website Colmena66.com, you can find more results such as this one. That basically, one of the things I want to highlight here is that over 66% of the businesses indicated they needed capital between $5,000 and $50,000 to keep their business going. That isn't a lot in the scheme of things. So we saw that we just needed a little push, and I know that Annie will talk about what they did on that end very massively during that time. We also saw that many of these entrepreneurs were able to save a lot of their inventory. They just couldn't open their shops because they had no electricity. And they hadn't, this is now November, and they have had no sales since September 6th because Hurricane Irma hit us on September 6th. So it's September, October, we're going on November, we're hitting the holidays when it's their high season, and they have no revenues. What do we do so that all these people do not leave the island for good? So we decided that we needed to do like a directory of all the online shops, and then drive traffic from our diaspora and the friends of Puerto Rico to make their holiday shopping through this website, so that these entrepreneurs had cash and were able to keep their stores open. And at the same time, we saw, well, let's do the same thing with our freelancers, professional services that had a lot of their contracts canceled, and we invited them to work from our co-working spaces and also join this website so that they could market their skills outside Puerto Rico. And it was amazing. We had all eyes on Puerto Rico. Many publications picked up on this, and it was crucial to the fact that we were able to launch this before Black Friday. So we were able to leverage Cyber Monday, the holidays, and we have amazing testimonials and results of how this changed these entrepreneurs. And what did we learn? We learned that think about what should be done, but also what should you do, because it can be very overwhelming. And then also think about what can be done with the resources that you have at hand, because there's no time to ask for permission or to have people pull strings or align things for you. You just have to identify what can be done with the resources that I have and just do it together. And this is super, super important. I think that one of the main things that makes me really happy about how we've been able to turn this into something positive is that there's a lot more trust between all the players in the entrepreneurial ecosystem than ever. And with trust, and that's, once there's trust, you can build on that and make amazing things happen. So we just need to keep moving so that this child, if he wants to become an entrepreneur, can do so from Puerto Rico and grow from Puerto Rico to the world. What's next? We are learning from our partners at Kansas City. They did a resource railway. This is a map, literally a map that you as an entrepreneur can follow so that you can see all the resources that are available for you, depending on the stage of business and depending on the type of business that you have. We're working on this. Anyone wants to join this? Let's do it together. We're also working on doing a second census. We're getting a lot of questions about, what about those businesses that were temporarily closed when you talk to them? How are they doing today? Well, we don't know. We'd love to know if they were able to reopen or if they had to close for good. So we're applying for funding to do this again. And I want to invite you during Global Entrepreneurship Week on November 14 through 16 to Puerto Rico for Puerto Rico Entrepreneurship Week. The ecosystem is going to get together and do this for the first time. We're learning about this model from our friends at New Orleans, which many of us visited a few months ago. They did New Orleans Entrepreneurship Week, and for 10 years, it has been great in the reconstruction post-Katrina. So again, replicating things that have worked elsewhere, and now sharing what we've learned with communities that are also prone to natural disasters, because these things will continue to happen, and we need to be more resilient and more prepared in the future. With that, I want to present Annie Mayol so that she can share with you what Foundation for Puerto Rico has been working on.
Thank you. So this is what happens when you have entrepreneurs working in disasters. One example. Isn't that wonderful? Not just thinking about immediate relief, but thinking about how do we support our economic development. Before showing this short video, which summarizes what our Foundation for Puerto Rico has done and is working on in the rebuilding of Puerto Rico. Thank you. Again, my name is Annie Mayol. I'm the president and CEO. I say president so my CEO doesn't get upset.
Oh, sorry.
One of the things is Foundation for Puerto Rico is an economic development, not-for-profit organization in Puerto Rico since 2011. As an economic development organization, we've worked with different sectors of the economy in identifying economic development strategies that can help Puerto Rico rebuild. Not rebuild meaning Maria, but really to the future in a fiscal crisis. One thing that was very much benefit to the work we did ahead of time before Maria was that we had an open shared space facility, as stated by Denisse, where we really focus on incubating other NGOs, not private sector companies, other NGOs that were very important to the ecosystem in Puerto Rico in helping our economic development. And one of the things that happened is September 20th, so September 23rd, 3 days after we opened our offices. We had, thanks to many, and you'll hear about some of our great entrepreneurs here, like Jesse, but we were able to, one of where we're housed, we had amazing people that were able to give us Wi-Fi immediately after with satellite towers, and we had water, we had electricity. So what happened, we had 180 organizations come to our facility, more than 300 people in our space. So thank you that they opened in October because we couldn't fit in our space. We have organizations all over, from not-for-profit organizations that we worked with, that we had relationships, local, international, like Oxfam, other ones that were coming in. We also had government officials there. We had FEMA, we had Puerto Rico government. We had private sector, Carnival Cruise, airlines. Everybody had to find a way to make payroll, to know where their employees were, to have basic communication for them to continue to do their business. So I say that because when you see our video, we'll talk a little bit about the work that we did, but I think one of the things that really helped us really find the synergies on what is the future of Puerto Rico was because we had that space and we had people come there and really discuss and identify more innovative ideas. And I think this, and I want to thank for the invitation, I want to thank the invitation the people that are here, because this is another innovative idea of how do we think about Puerto Rico in the future. And we think about it outside of the box in different ways and not your traditional ways that are standard. And so I think the island of Puerto Rico is an amazing asset to the world, and that's our vision as an organization. We really do think Puerto Rico is a destination to the world to live. Of course, I live there, invest, work, and visit. So everybody, please come visit us. Entrepreneurship Week, whatever it is, we want to get more people back to Puerto Rico because we are open. We're open for business. Even though we went through a very bad pictures around the world, which has impacted us greatly, and it continues to impact in getting people to come visit Puerto Rico, which is one of our major economic sectors. That's not the reality today. We have people without electricity, but we're a very resilient community, and our culture and our people are the most resilient that I've seen, more than our infrastructure, of course, but definitely the people are very resilient. And so I'm going to give you a quick video, and then after the video, I'm just going to summarize 2 things that I think are key in today's discussions and leave space. Actually, maybe the video, and then we can just take questions will be easier. So make sure that we start from the beginning. Foundation for Puerto Rico seeks to unleash the island's full potential as an active participant in the world's economy with sustainable programs that drive social and economic development. From knowledge to action, our goal is to transform Puerto Rico into a destination to the world. We want people to come to Puerto Rico to visit, to live, work, and invest, which will result in multi-million-dollar growth from the island's economic development. Our programs align with the visitors' economy and the island's recovery efforts, resulting in long-term sustainable economic growth.
2 deadly natural disasters to report this morning. Hurricane Maria making landfall on Puerto Rico in just the past hour.
After Hurricanes Irma and Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico, Foundation for Puerto Rico directed all of its resources to facilitate response and coordinate recovery initiatives to aid our communities. Hurricane Maria left the island devastated and in a complete blackout. Our recovery efforts were many, including opening our doors to more than 180 local and international organizations and becoming a command central. We wanted to assess, connect, reopen, and restart the economy. So we maintain small businesses open by providing more than $500,000 in cash grants. Through our 231 completed missions, we impacted communities by providing immediate support, basic necessities, and damage assessment. We provided support and capital to agro entrepreneurs to spark plug the agricultural industry as well. We served as fiscal sponsors so other local non-for-profits could receive more than $10 million in grants to help others. After getting through the emergency, we looked into the future.
Many communities were falling behind their recovery and were not equipped for future disasters. We at the foundation felt it was imperative to help these communities build their own economic development programs and build resilient infrastructure so they could sustain future storms and can have sustainable growth throughout the future. This led to the creation of our foundation's bottom-up Destination Recovery Initiative, a community-based economic development program that we're hoping can set the standard for recovery programs across Puerto Rico.
Help us continue our effort to make Puerto Rico a destination to the world, because there is no future in rebuilding the past. So there's no future in rebuilding the past is really what I think is a key to this activity we're having today. I think that having more like this around the US, more of these discussions around the world, really allows for Puerto Rico to look at best practices. Just 3 things that I wanted to highlight. One, as an organization, because we really truly believe that entrepreneurship, the sector of the business sector is really a key component to driving our communities and being able to really sustain and rebuild. Right after Maria, on October, we were already out there giving support to our small and medium-sized businesses with immediate relief, cash. one of the things that happens with government is all the bureaucracies in getting a small business grant or getting a small business loan and the risk that the business owners would have to take in order to actually get that relief. But in order for us to be able to have a community stay, they need to have the facilities to be able to buy milk, to be able to actually get food. So we quickly went into the major sections around the island to give small business cash grants between $1,500 and $5,000 that allow for them to be able to stay open. It's a process that we continue to do. We actually, till this day, when we go to a business and give them support, most of them say we're the only one that's given them any support. And they're the core of our economic work. So I think the key here is sectors of the economy that are, gaps that we find in the process, and how do we work with these gaps in order to implement strategies to recover. So we've given out to about 200 businesses, $500,000, and we continue to work in that process. Second, which I think is very key, is our entrepreneurs and how we help these entrepreneurs expand. So Foundation for Puerto Rico is being very supportive and helping in the component of acceleration and incubation of entrepreneurs, not just in metropolitan areas, but outside. So we're bringing those services outside of San Juan, these types of incubations, like Colmena and other people. We want them to go out of, be in Orocovis, be in Aguadillas, be in the center of the islands where most people need to have the ability to understand that there's a hope and there's a future for them to be businessmen. And the last component I do want to say, which I think is key, is when we talk about rebuilding Puerto Rico and infrastructure, which was discussed before, one of the things that Foundation is working on, which is the bottom-up recovery initiative, and was briefly mentioned in the video, it's a more detailed project that we're actually piloting in the center of the mountain, the West Coast and the East Coast, is how do we build capacity, infrastructure that's sustainable, that's resilient, and I know Jesse will talk about that, so I won't go into that, but the importance of having the capacity for our businesses to quickly open and serve as hubs for the community in a potential future disaster, which unfortunately we're in the Caribbean islands, so most likely we'll have another hurricane in the next couple of years, hopefully not as this bad, we'll be prepared. But thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you for putting this together.
Thank you, Annie. I'd like to turn it over to Luis Davila, attorney at DLA Piper. Luis, we would love to know your take on what you're doing. I know that you're very involved with the blockchain industry, and we'd love to learn more about your take on the reconstruction of Puerto Rico in that sense as well.
Thank you very much. My name is Luis Davila. I'm an attorney here at DLA Piper. We're a global law firm, but we have offices in San Juan as well. I recently visited the island back in March, and full disclosure, I was born and raised Puerto Rican, so I travel a lot to Puerto Rico. I have all my family over there. I was there, and I noticed an influx of investors coming in. Lots of people very excited about Puerto Rico, looking to share the knowledge and the successes and the accomplishments that they have done in other places. And then you had other types of people that wanted to think how they could make a quick buck or a quick cash. So I think that's very important when it relates to people moving to Puerto Rico, looking to relocate their businesses or to relocate their whole lives to Puerto Rico. I believe there should be the center or the idea behind moving should be trying to give back to the community, and it must go beyond the typical $5,000 donation that you give to a charity. You have to think of how your product, how your business is going to contribute or collaborate to the ecosystem that is trying to thrive in Puerto Rico. That is something that I saw, and you could tell just by sitting down 5 minutes with someone who was really into for the long term and who was trying to really get a quick tax break. So I think that's important when when you go to Puerto Rico, and it can't we can't let the movement to bring startups to try to incentivize entrepreneurship. We can't let it get stained by these subjects that just want to come in and take advantage of some taxes.
Thank you for alluding to the Law 2022 incentives. Maybe some of our audience are not aware of what those incentives entail. Would you mind going a little bit into what that represents for entrepreneurs?
So you've heard it. Basically, there are some tax incentives that have been in place in Puerto Rico for some time now, where you get a fixed income rate of 4% for commercial manufacturers. There's a 50% tax credit for R&D, research and development. Under several other tax incentives, you could be subject or you can be free from paying capital gain taxes. For purposes, Puerto Rico is domestic for many platforms, but in terms of taxes, we are considered foreign jurisdiction. So that's why there has been an influx of investors and people trying to relocate to Puerto Rico to get taken advantage of those incentives.
And you mentioned about ways that these investors or entrepreneurs can further support the development of Puerto Rico. You mentioned one of them, mentoring. In case you're not aware, there's a global startup accelerator in Puerto Rico actively looking for mentors in residence. So there are opportunities. Just ask us. We're happy to take this conversation and continue it online after the event. There are ways that we can connect you with entrepreneurs that you can support in many ways.
Yeah, I think that's very, very, very important. The mentorship for our young professionals and for our students is essential. Puerto Rico graduates approximately between 22,000 to 25,000 STEM students and professionals every year, and around 60 to 70% of those end up leaving the island for some job outside. So it's very important, the mentorship. I was just reading an article that was published a couple of days ago in the local paper, El Nuevo Dia. Quick shout out to my friend Jose Delgado, who is here, correspondent for the paper in Washington, D.C. And they were talking about how this investor named Dave Watkins partnered with a young professional named Jose Ortiz and his business named Dame Un Bite. He pretty much a student, came out of college. He participated in one of these accelerator events, and he was pretty much kind of adopted by Watkins. Watkins is helping him. He believed in his idea, but I believe the real value in his investment is the mentorship, really helping him understand how to grow the business and how to go about being a young entrepreneur.
Thank you. Jesse, would love to know about the technology that you amazingly deployed in Puerto Rico at a very crucial time. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I'm Jesse Levine. I started an organization called Tactivate. We basically do two things. One is we employ the same tactics and strategies from military special operations and international disaster response to launching companies really quickly, stateside, hand in hand with veterans. And then we take that cash flow and we do a lot of international disaster response work where we employ something we call expeditionary entrepreneurship, where we deploy teams of special operations veterans and entrepreneurs to go help. So I'm actually not the technology guy. I can tell you about that. I'll touch on it. But really, just to kind of keep it overarching, the word resiliency gets tossed around a lot. And I always say, thank God this happened in Puerto Rico, because in point of fact, the people there are incredibly resilient. And if this happened in the US, there'd be massive civil unrest and kind of insurrection in like 3 days. I mean, 2 days after Hurricane Sandy, there's fistfights in the parking lot of Home Depot over generators. But it's really interesting, to kind of switch the paradigm. What Puerto Rico is very interesting. If you look at it, it's kind of like a Sim City opportunity. And I don't mean that from an exploitive, disaster capitalist shock doctrine perspective. I mean that it's a pretty unique occurrence. And I say this, people get pretty angry, but this was far more of an economic emergency versus a humanitarian disaster, which is not to downplay the humanitarian impact and not to imply that it wasn't a major problem and still is. However, very rarely is the entire power grid and communications grid gone down completely. And that presented a lot of really interesting challenges. So just to kind of allude to what we did, but one thing to look at is the culture, both stateside, internationally, is very dependent. There's this idea when something happens that, FEMA is going to come or the UN is going to step in or the large international NGOs are going to come and kind of save the day. And our philosophy is, and I think you guys are all probably familiar with corporate social responsibility. It's really the individuals and the local businesses, corporate responsibility or obligation to be able to provide for their community, which are their customers, right, in time of need. And if they do nothing else but that, if they can simply provide a continuity of service, whether it's a bank or a small store, then what you have is you have a local kind of indigenous capacity. You've got a local existing infrastructure that can really provide a lot of the needs that the community has, and you reduce the dependence on external aid, which has a lot of negative implications, as a matter of fact. Aid is very top-down and tends to be very detrimental to economies where it's employed. So I can go on about that for a long time, but one thing that we did is we try to get very last mile very quickly. This is a very strange response, very different from Haiti or Philippines, where FEMA was in charge because it was a territory of the U.S. And there's a lot of kind of misunderstanding and miseducation as to what FEMA can do and who they are and how they operate. I think they're very aware that they need to change and modernize, but to kind of bastardize and blame them for what happened in Puerto Rico is a bit unfair because they're not legally structured or stood up or trained to do what they had to do in Puerto Rico. So we got we land, we're self-sustaining. We don't need anybody to support us. We can do our own communications, our own medical, our own food, whatever. So we got out in the field and very quickly realized food and water. There's a lot of talk in the press about the logistical challenges of food and water and how do we get food and water to the island and the truck drivers strike and so on and so forth. But if you actually drove around, Barranquitas and wherever, way out there, there's all of these little stores where these merchants, and this was maybe a week after the storm, week and a half, they had fought to keep their stores open. They were paying their employees out of pocket. Their shelves were actually pretty well stocked. They had food, they had water. So on one side, you had the traditional paradigm and perspective. We need to get more food and water out into the village. We've got this huge logistical challenge. But on the contrary, there's food and water that existed in the village, in all these little cities and towns and whatever. And there's Walmarts. Puerto Rico isn't a Haiti. So there's a lot of stuff that was local. The problem was that communications were down, and it was a cashless society. And of course, the merchants were doing what they could for their communities and giving away food. And of course, there was an acute period when emergency food and water was needed. But very quickly, that goes away. So what we brought back to FEMA and to the government and said, hey guys, this is a connectivity issue, not a logistics issue, because all the point of sale systems are down. And roughly 45% of the Puerto Rican population relies on EBT, which is food stamps, which is an electronic credit card to buy food and water. And they couldn't use them, right? So you had all of these merchants who had food and water they were trying to sell and help their community, but they couldn't take, no one had cash and they couldn't take credit cards, so they had lost their ability to sell and people had lost their purchasing power. So to fix that, so getting food and water out there wasn't the problem, we had to get food and water to the community. So we went around and we put a bunch of different resource groups together, and one of the main functions that we try to do is, it's very siloed. You've got the local entrepreneurs, you've got incredible resources like Foundation for Puerto Rico and all these amazing people, but they're not necessarily talking to FEMA or to the large NGOs or to DOD or to State Department or whatever the case may be. So you've got a lot of latent potential and capacity that sits untapped because people just don't communicate across their respective resource communities. So we try to kind of, in a very guerrilla manner, do that informally. And there's a lot of tactics and strategies we use to do that. But essentially, we work with the military because we have military guys on our team. So we go and say, hey, we need helicopters. And then we go to the government and say, hey, we need to do this economic stimulation project because the merchants need to make money. We need to stimulate the economy because a broken economy, a place can't heal, right? Merchants need to start selling so they can pay their staff, start buying more food, and we just solve this problem. So anyway, we went around and we deployed these very cheap M2M satellite terminals, which are roughly $1,200 a pop. And we put them into all the stores in these strategic areas that were very far from large population centers or Walmarts or what have you, and connected them so they now had SATCOM connectivity for their point of sale systems because they could start taking the EBT cards, selling food and water, stimulating the local economy, and becoming less dependent on the system. And we partnered, thank God, with Foundation for Puerto Rico, who supported that because it was, in fact, an economic development project And people always ask us, well, how do you guys fund yourselves and make money? You know, we don't in disasters. We're not a non-for-profit, but we spend a lot of money, and our Amex bills we're getting we're getting pretty significant. So Foundation stepped in, and you know, with the 13 or 14 terminals that we deployed over the course of a couple months, there's roughly, and we can't quote this exactly because getting information from PREPA is next to impossible, but we had some raw data sets, and the first numbers we ran, where we took a blended average, was a couple $1 million in transactions just after the first month of deployment. So there's well over $4 million, $5 million in transactions that have gone through these local tiendas, you know, versus MREs and bottled water being, you know, deployed to all these places, which are really detrimental, not really useful. So that was the solution. The idea is to have infrastructure in place to make these resources, you know, ready so they can be resilient. You know, we view resiliency as a kind of an end state, and you can't be resilient if you're not ready. So now these key locations, I believe, have these terminals still installed, and they can flip a switch next time the comms go down, and they can still provide food and water to the communities.
Yeah, and we're installing more. So, we're talking to Evertech to get you the data.
I think it's very valuable how this connection happened, and how in the midst of everything that was happening, there was a lot of help, a lot of donations, a lot of access to grants, to low interest loans. There were generators being given for free by organizations and associations, but then there was a disconnect. Entrepreneurs didn't know where to go for that help, and these organizations, they're on a fire drill. They don't have the time to be on the road all the time. So that's where we were able to act as an ecosystem and research all the help that was happening, make it available to everyone. We went old school. We were printing out lists of all the help and phone numbers of where to call. So that was I think, very powerful. The question is, how do we document everything that happened, Jesse and Annie and Luis, so that when we go through this again, which will unfortunately happen again, we hope that we have some years to recover, how are we able to act in a quicker way? Because there's hopefully like a toolkit, some procedures. That's something that I'm actually thinking about these days a lot. Any thoughts on that?
I'll jump on that if you want. There was a fellow sitting in here, I think he left, his name was Dr. Wells, but he used to run something called Star Tides out of the National Defense University, which was a best practices repository that took from NGOs, first responders, military, what works in a disaster response environment from a technological perspective, a communications platform, you name it, and we would do these things called JIFIX exercises, which are joint integrated field exercises, which are basically war game response scenario. You know, how do NGOs work better with military, work better with state, work better with local entrepreneurs? So there's huge repositories of best practices and technologies that exist, right? And the challenging part, and like what's interesting about Puerto Rico and why we took a big step back recently, is because the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So this happened in Haiti, this happened in you know, the Philippines, this happened in Texas, this happened in Panama, and it's happening again in Puerto Rico, where everyone's always reinventing the wheel, right? This isn't new. This has happened before. There are platforms and systems. When you hear these entrepreneurs and you see them stand up these amazing initiatives, these young kids who set up networks of GoTennas and, you know, are sending, you know, communications and setting up their own supply chains, it's phenomenal. And that is a more effective capacity and resource in these scenarios than, more often than not, the government. But, you know, I think what needs to happen, and there's a conversation that's not happening with like this whole of governance topic. You know, we just spoke about this at William & Mary 2 weeks ago, where everyone is realizing that there isn't enough communication and there isn't enough focus on proactive readiness. And everyone is still very much in this reactionary state. And I would venture to say that Puerto Rico is still very much in a reactionary position while the conversation is being had. You know, we need to be more prepared. We have these technologies in place now, but there really isn't this robust, sophisticated, kind of synthesized paradigm shift where, okay, we have these entrepreneurs, we have these resources, we have Foundation of Puerto Rico, we have, you know, DLA Piper, we have these mentors, we have the warehouse owner, we have the, you know, the guy delivering generators, what's his name, De La Cruz, you know, all these guys who are amazing local entrepreneurs. They need to be proactively organized and preemptively organized. And it's okay that it's a for-profit business and the local merchants and the local entrepreneurs, because, you know, if they're making money but they're solving a problem, like that's sustainable, right? That means it's not relying on NGOs, which are not necessarily the most sustainable long-term solution. So I think, what we'd love to see and what we're trying to coordinate from a very higher level in Puerto Rico, and it's a very interesting opportunity to do this on a global scale, is Puerto Rico, because of its geographic size, because of how tight-knit the community is, can really become a subject matter expert, a leading expert in setting the example for how to do this. Like, how does your economy recover quickly? How do you self-organize? How do you build communications infrastructure and supply chain infrastructure and entrepreneurial ecosystems to be core response, to be your core, to rely on it, right? To rely on what you have locally.
Thank you. We unfortunately do not have time for a Q&A, but please come to us, ask us any questions you may have. We're going to be around. I'd like to ask you if you have any last remarks that you'd like to share with the audience.
Sorry for speaking so much.
No.
No. So just, foundationforpuertorico.org, and you can get more information from our organization and some of the things that are happening as we speak in Puerto Rico. And I think, we welcome any connections. We're all big about connectors, so connections to people, to organizations, to best practices. To his point, Resilience Lab, Innovation Lab, there's a number of organizations that have worked in disasters around the world and have worked with innovative ideas. So, the more contacts we can get to bring down to Puerto Rico, the better.
I would say we need to focus on education in so many levels. I think education, like you said, to the different components, government, the private sector, and everything, when we're talking about preparing for a catastrophe like this. And also going back to the beginning of this forum about entrepreneurship, I think we should look at maybe including entrepreneurship as part of the education and the curriculum system of public schools in Puerto Rico from a very early stage. I think it's a point in time when if you can focus and you can get the students to see themselves as the future CEOs of the company instead of preparing them to work for someone else, could make a huge difference.
We want to thank Startup Society Summit for inviting us to share with you our experiences. I think there's going to be a lot more of this, a lot of more sharing with other communities how Puerto Rico is rebuilding. So let's keep the conversation going. As Annie mentioned, connect us with more people that we can that can support us and that we can support as well. And we invite you to share what we're doing with others, and all things related to entrepreneurship, science, technology. We're happy to help out and connect you with how you can bring that to Puerto Rico in a sustainable way via private sector, nonprofit, so that it can stick. Thank you.